On a late spring day in 1974, two young and weary hikers were nearing the end of a day on the Appalachian Trail. And while they walked down a side trail leading to a campsite and shelter, they had no idea that the next morning, only one of them would be walking back up it. Waiting for them at the shelter was a disheveled man, one that didn't look like a typical hiker. And this set off the alarm bells for Joel Polson, the older of the two thru hikers, who actually whispered his concern to his younger hiking partner, Margaret Harriet. However, despite these initial concerns, by the time dinner was over, Joel had actually warmed up to the mysterious man. He even told Margaret, quote, "This guy is all right." And soon after this, everyone went to bed. Eventually, morning came, and Joel, for whatever reason, still wanted to just get out of Low Gap as soon as possible. He was already packed up by the time Margaret woke, and as she started to gather her things, Joel walked over to a nearby stream to go and clean up. And as he did this, the strange man that the two had shared the campsite with woke up and hopped out of the shelter. Margaret began to put on her boots. She was nearly done lacing them up, anticipating what was surely to be a difficult day on the trail, when all of a sudden, she heard a loud bang. It was a gunshot, and this gunshot would prove to be the start of a nightmare that would drag on way longer than anybody, especially Margaret herself, expected. Within a few short hours, Margaret would once again be heading north on the Appalachian Trail, except this time, instead of doing it willingly, she was doing it at gunpoint. She was following the lead of a madman who had just killed her hiking partner and now had absolutely nothing to lose. This is the story of Ralph Howard Fox, the very first Appalachian Trail killer. When I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2018, I spent the fourth night of what would end up being a 140-night hike at Low Gap Shelter in Georgia. At the time, I didn't know anything about the events that had transpired there. And to start off here, I'm just going to say that if you're planning on hiking the Appalachian Trail in the future, I'd suggest maybe waiting to watch this video until after you've already finished the trail. But for everybody else, please join me on a trip to Georgia. Now, this trip is free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover the cost of admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer and you found yourself watching a number of my videos. In 1974, Joel Polson met Margaret Harriet while she was working at a restaurant and almost immediately invited her on the trip of a lifetime. He asked her if she wanted to join him on a thru hike of the Appalachian Trail. 26-year-old Joel was not an experienced hiker by any stretch of the imagination, but with that said, he was no stranger to adventure and the outdoors. A few years earlier, he had actually ridden his bicycle from his hometown in Hartsville, South Carolina, all the way to northern Ohio. I know that he also did at least one other long-distance bicycle trip, and at some point, his passion for biking had actually transformed into a newfound passion for backpacking, and he was somehow able to convince 17-year-old Margaret, who he again had just met, to take on the Appalachian Trail with him. Margaret Harriet was no hiker either, but curiosity had gotten the best of her. At the time, she was a student at the University of South Carolina, and she hadn't really been enjoying it. She figured that an adventure like the Appalachian Trail would provide her some clarity, maybe even some direction on what she should do next. And in addition to that, she just liked Joel Polson's attitude. To be clear, there was no romance between the two, but Polson shared Margaret's sense of adventure, and she also trusted him. And so after bending the truth a little bit to her parents, convincing them that she would be part of a 15-person expedition on the AT instead of just the two of them thru hiking, Margaret and Joel reached their starting point on the trail. The actual southern terminus of the AT was 37 miles south of their location, but Joel had actually already hiked that section of the trail, and therefore Tesnati Gap would be the southern terminus of their hike. Now, I'm not gonna lie, folks, this story is about to get really, really dark and scary, and so before we get there, I just want to keep things light and fun for just a moment and let you know that one of you is going to be the lucky winner of a giveaway that I am doing with Decathlon. That's right, Decathlon is the sponsor of this video. They make the best budget outdoor gear in the game, and so let me tell you what we're giving away and tell you how to enter. First up, we got the MT100 down jacket, which I think is the most underrated down jacket out there at the moment. We have the Quechua MH100 two-person tent, and by the way, I think this is the perfect budget car camping tent. Next, we have the NH Escape 500 roll top backpack, which in my opinion is a great hybrid between a day hiking pack and just a regular backpack for travel. We also have some clothing items like the MT500 merino wool hat and the men's MH520 hood hiking fleece jacket. Oh, and this merino wool hiking t-shirt that I'm wearing right now is also going to be included in the giveaway. Well, actually, not this literal shirt. You're going to get a fresh, clean one. Anyways, here's how to enter. At the top of the description for this video, I have a link to an Instagram reel that I made showing off all of these items. The rules for this giveaway will be to like that Instagram reel, then follow at Decathlon USA and at Kyle Hates Hiking, and then you'll need to tag 2 friends in the comment section of the reel. This giveaway is not affiliated with Instagram or YouTube, and winners must live in the United States. So if you want to win some free gear, make sure you go enter ASAP because a winner is going to be chosen on December 13th. Thank you to Decathlon for sponsoring this video and for giving back to my audience. And with that said, let's get back to the video. On the first day of their hike, Joel and Margaret got a very late start. And as a result, they didn't cover many miles that first day, and all of the miles that they did do were in the dark. And so the next morning they woke up and began their first full day of hiking, and they quickly realized how difficult the Appalachian Trail really was. Despite incredible advancements in backpacking gear and technology, even today, a thru hike of the Appalachian Trail is not easy whatsoever. And so I can only imagine that in the early 70s, it must have just been even more ridiculously difficult. And it's honestly no surprise to me that less than 100 people had completed the AT in the year before this story took place, 1973. Nowadays, that number is well over 1,000 pretty much every single year. Margaret and Joel were carrying very heavy external frame packs, and Margaret had actually began to get blisters before lunchtime even arrived. But despite this, they trudged on, and they eventually stopped to chat with a group of workers who were out doing trail maintenance. They continued hiking after this, and finally, by late afternoon, they reached a junction for Low Gap Shelter. At this point in the day, they had only hiked 6 miles, but they decided that they didn't want to go any further and that Low Gap would be their home for the night. And therefore, Joel and Margaret made their way down the 200-yard side trail towards the shelter. When they arrived at this shelter, there was a man inside who introduced himself as Ralph. There was nobody else there, and so the 3 of them would all be sharing camp together that night. Margaret didn't really think twice about the man in the shelter. Perhaps she had let her guard down due to exhaustion. I mean, after all, she had been on trail for nearly 24 hours at this point. But Joel, on the other hand, well, he got a weird feeling about this man. His gut was telling him that something wasn't right, and he actually got anxious when he and Margaret walked down to the water source away from the shelter. While down there, Joel told Margaret that this Ralph man did not look like a typical hiker. He wasn't wearing normal hiking attire, and he didn't have the typical gear that a hiker would carry. Joel and Margaret had left their packs in the shelter right next to Ralph, and Joel feared that this man might be in the process of stealing their belongings at that very moment. And so they quickly walked back up to the shelter and were relieved to find that Ralph hadn't touched any of their gear. Over the next few hours, not much conversation took place between the pair and Ralph, but apparently Joel did actually start to slowly warm up to the man. Warm up both figuratively, but also literally. And what I mean by that is one of the things that actually changed Joel's mind was Ralph's repeated trips to gather firewood, which is no easy task, by the way, especially after a long day of hiking. He even told Margaret, quote, "This guy is all right." There were still seeds of doubt in the back of Joel's mind, however. He insisted that he and Margaret leave the shelter early the next morning, and when morning came around, he held true to this. By the time Margaret woke up, Joel had already packed up all of his gear and he was eager to hit the trail. Sensing some urgency in his demeanor, Margaret quickly started to get ready while Joel made one last trip down to the stream to freshen up. Now, this stream is not very far away from the front of the shelter, and so Margaret was actually able to watch as Joel bent down to splash some water on his face and then turn around to walk back towards the shelter. While all this was going on, Margaret also watched as Ralph hopped out of the shelter. Margaret then looked down and began lacing her boots. She was nearly finished doing this when all of a sudden she heard a loud blast and saw that Joel was now slumped on the ground. It quickly became apparent what had happened. Seemingly out of nowhere, Ralph had attacked. Ralph then came back into the shelter and tied Margaret up. He then led her outside and away from the shelter and tied her to a tree. He then told her that he didn't know what he was going to do with her, and this wasn't a part of some master plan. And Ralph's actions would soon prove that he wasn't kidding. He literally didn't have a clue what to do next, and he was just running off of pure evil instinct. About 15 minutes passed, and then Ralph returned to untie Margaret. It's at this point that she asked him where Joel was, to which Ralph replied, quote, "I got rid of him." Joel Poulsen had officially become the first victim of murder in Appalachian Trail history. Still unsure of what to do next, Ralph began going through Joel's gear looking for money. And then, for the second time, he marched Margaret back into the woods and tied her up. He told her that he was not going to kill her, but was instead gonna leave her tied up with some water and food, and that he was gonna leave a note at the shelter saying where she was. I guess he thought that someone would see the note and come find her. I don't know, but he did this, and then he walked away. But just like the first time, 15 minutes later, he came back. And this time, Margaret thought for sure that he was gonna kill her. But instead, Ralph came back with a confession. He told Margaret that he had killed Joel because he wanted his gear, and that Joel was too big of a man for Ralph to just simply take it from him otherwise. He also said that he didn't feel right leaving Margaret tied up in the woods because it could potentially kill her if nobody saw the note. In a random burst of twisted compassion, he told Margaret that he didn't want to kill her and that he had, quote, never whacked a chick before. This would end up being the first of numerous instances where Ralph took pity on Margaret, which is one of the most bizarre things about this story. Margaret was the only witness to Joel's murder and the only person who could potentially point the finger at Ralph, and there he was all alone in the middle of the woods with her. Conventional wisdom, as scary as it sounds, would assume that a psychopath killer like Ralph would murder Margaret too, right then and there. Ralph didn't do that. Instead, he told Margaret that if she wanted to, she could stay tied up, or she could join him and actually hike out to the next highway where he would then let her go. Faced with these options, Margaret chose to hike, and before she knew it, she was back on the Appalachian Trail heading north with an armed murderer guiding her from behind. At the start of their trek, Ralph told Margaret that if she told any other hikers about what was happening, he would kill her and then kill all the other hikers. A chilling threat that definitely didn't help Margaret's confidence in her ability to make it to the highway alive. But after this, Ralph's twisted compassion would come out again as he made sure that Margaret was comfortable on their hike. Margaret was actually quoted saying he, referring to Ralph, was unbelievably kind to me. He really was. He kept being sure I had food and that I rested when we were coming down the mountain. I rested as much as I wanted. But Margaret would soon be put to the test when her and Ralph passed some workers doing trail maintenance. When they encountered these workers, Margaret froze in fear because she realized that one of the men was in the group that her and Joel had stopped and chatted with the previous day. She was afraid that this worker would recognize her and realized that something wasn't right. This man did in fact recognize Margaret, and through a twist of fate, he somehow didn't realize that she was now hiking with a different man. Maybe it was because Ralph was now wearing Joel's backpack, or maybe the worker just wasn't very observant. Either way, the groups eventually parted ways, and nobody was hurt. During their conversation, Ralph and Margaret had received some intel from the workers, and this intel wasn't good. Apparently, the next road crossing north was a much further hike than they realized, and this made Margaret scared that she would likely need to spend at least one night, possibly more, in the woods with Ralph. He hadn't hurt her yet, and apparently had been quite nice to her, but she still feared that after a long day of hiking, he wouldn't be feeling so generous. While Ralph and Margaret hiked, they passed the time by doing what anyone else would, just simply talking. They talked about mundane things like books and music, and eventually Margaret took the opportunity to pry into Ralph's history just a bit. He told her that he was from up north and that he actually felt much more comfortable in the wilderness of the western United States than in the Appalachian Mountains. He also told her that he had been in and out of jail for years and that he was actually on the run from the FBI. Eventually, Ralph and Margaret stopped at Rocky Knob Shelter to take a break and consult their maps. And when they did this, they realized that the intel they had been given by the workers earlier was actually wrong. In reality, they were less than 3 miles away from the next road crossing, and they could probably make it before night if they hustled. This was good news for Margaret. She would no longer have to camp out in the woods with Joel's killer. However, this good news was quickly followed by bad news. Ralph decided that he would no longer be letting Margaret go at the road crossing and would instead let her go after the two spent the night hunkered down in a hotel. They hiked on and eventually made it to the road at Unicoi Gap. Ralph then reminded Margaret that if she said anything about being held against her will, or about Joel for that matter, then everyone who heard it would be shot. And then the two stuck out their thumbs and they quickly hitched a ride into the town of Helen, Georgia. Using money and traveler's checks that Ralph had stolen from Joel, the two of them checked into the Chattahoochee Motel under the names Mr. and Mrs. Joel Polson. At this point, Margaret was more scared than ever, and rightfully so. I mean, she was going to be stuck in a hotel room with this maniac who knows what he was going to do next. However, thankfully, instead of laying a finger on Margaret, Ralph instead turned on the TV and tried to see if Joel's death had made it onto the news yet. And it would turn out that it hadn't. And so Ralph felt safe for the moment. They ate some food, and then Margaret took a shower. Ralph followed her into the bathroom, but only to make sure that she didn't escape out the window. He actually didn't even touch her, let alone try to Afterwards, they got to talking again, and their conversation was just as strange as the one that had taken place while they were hiking. Ralph told Margaret that he could tell how nervous she had been on the hike earlier in the day, and that he had actually almost given her the gun just so she would know that he wasn't gonna shoot her. He told her bizarre things like that he personally knew folk singer Arlo Guthrie, and he even told her that, quote, he wished that he could have met me, referring to Margaret, under other circumstances. That if he hadn't been doing all this, then he could really like me. But then the conversation turned more sinister. Margaret asked Ralph if he had ever killed anyone before Joel, and Ralph answered yes. However, He insisted it was, quote, more or less a kind of a fight or self-defense or something. I really doubt that made Margaret feel any better, but she still managed to fall asleep that night and actually slept pretty good. In the morning, they packed up and got some coffee, and Ralph still insisted that he was gonna let Margaret go. However, he didn't feel comfortable letting her hitchhike back to her home in Columbia, South Carolina. In yet another instance of Ralph's twisted compassion, he thought the idea of Margaret hitchhiking alone was far too dangerous for her. Instead, they would go to a bus station and they would each catch a separate bus. They thumbed a ride to Cleveland, Georgia, and eventually arrived at the bus station. For the first time since Ralph had shot Joel, Margaret must have been thinking that she might actually make it home alive. She walked up to the counter and asked for a ticket to Columbia, but she was then told that there were no direct routes that would get her home. Margaret was, again, forced back into Ralph's captivity, and the two of them hitched another ride to a different bus station. Once they arrived, they had to wait for a while, but eventually they were able to purchase their tickets. Margaret bought a ticket to Columbia, and Ralph bought a ticket to Atlanta. They still had some time to kill before their departures, and this gave Ralph one last opportunity to walk the line between compassion and threats. He told Margaret that he knew that she would tell the police what had happened, and he was still letting her go anyways. But he also warned that if she went to the police immediately and they were there waiting for him when he got off the bus in Atlanta, that lots of innocent people were going to die. And shortly after this warning, Ralph got on his bus and then he was gone. Margaret was now free from Ralph's captivity, and she was also somehow completely unharmed. I should specify, she was physically unharmed. She was still, however, incredibly scared, and she heeded Ralph's warning about not calling the cops immediately. She took her bus to Columbia, and she arrived later that night. Her first course of action after arriving was to call her brother, but he didn't answer the phone. Then she called a friend and had similar results. Next, she tried calling her parents, who also didn't answer the phone. And so finally, she called the police and she asked for someone to come pick her up. She told them that she had witnessed a murder in Georgia and she needed to tell them about it. An investigation was launched, and on May 11th, 1974, Joel Polson's body was found nearby Low Gap Shelter. And a few days later, a woman in Atlanta called police and reported that she recognized a man who matched the description of the Appalachian Trail killer. She had read about the crime in the newspaper. 31-year-old Ralph Howard Fox was arrested at gunpoint on May 16th, 1974. Just as he had told Margaret, he did in fact have a criminal history. He had previously been arrested for kidnapping, car theft, breaking and entering, and much, much more. He was convicted for the murder and was sentenced to life in prison, but somehow managed to get himself let out on parole in mid-1991. And predictably, Ralph Fox would go on to kill again, this time a woman in Michigan, and by the end of 1992, he was once again back behind bars. This time, thankfully, he would remain locked up all the way until his death in 2003. What an absolute miscarriage of justice it was to let him out on parole that first time. Absolutely unbelievable. Margaret Harriet would go on to earn a doctorate degree and have a successful career with the U.S. Agency for International Development. The resilience she displayed during and after her nightmare ordeal is absolutely incredible. My heart goes out to her, and I hope she's doing well. My heart also goes out to Joel Polson, as well as his friends and family. At only 26 years old, he was taken far too soon, and in my opinion, justice was never served in his case due to the fact that Ralph Fox was let out on parole despite having a life sentence. I'd now like to leave you with a very important takeaway from this story, which is to always trust your gut. This story is scary, but the fact remains that every single year, millions of people set foot on the Appalachian Trail without incident. I've said this before, but you're far safer walking on the AT than you are walking down any city street in the United States, which is something that most of us do without thinking twice. But with that said, obviously, really scary things do happen. And so if you encounter someone on the AT or any trail for that matter that makes you uncomfortable, make sure that you listen to your gut. Pack up your stuff, keep hiking, just get away from this person. Do not spend the night with someone that gives you a bad feeling. Thank you for watching, and may Joel Poulsen rest in peace.